individually. My name is Jared. If I haven't had the opportunity to meet you, I have the opportunity to serve as both the lead pastor and the executive director over this family of churches called the Sacred Grace. And so the opportunities about the Rule of Life workshop that are coming up, as well as the all-parish business meeting, you'll get to see and hear a little bit more of what I do. My role is kind of two parts. One is spiritual director, both for the pastors and for the staff of the Sacred Grace. And then the other part is executive director. So I get the opportunity to spend a lot of time looking at spreadsheets and accounting reports, which I really enjoy. It's a love language for a handful of us in the room. So last Sunday at this time, I was a block off of Colfax celebrating with East Colfax for their very first gathering as a parish church. It was a beautiful event. There was like 75 people in the room, and it was just inspiring to see the support from the community, from people from different churches that came to be there for that very first Sunday. And ultimately, what we believe is that we're joining in what God has already been doing. And so it was a beautiful night. One of the most unique pieces of the night was at the end of the service, we got to do what I think a handful of churches get to do on their very first night gathering, which was to give $12,000 to Denver Street School. Denver Street School is located less than 2 blocks from where the Sacred Grace East Colfax is meeting, and so their whole staff was there for the first gathering. And at the end of the service, we had Denver Street School's principal, Casey, and her staff come up, and Ruben and Joe were able to give $12,000 away on the very first night of meeting as a church, which most churches, the very first night of meeting, don't give away $12,000. But this is one of the advantages of being a family, is that you get to do things together. And so it's really beautiful. And so we are, as has been said a few times tonight, in this season of Epiphany, this season in which we're reminded that the light of Jesus has come for all. And we're in a series specifically in the season of Epiphany that we're going to be looking through the book of Luke, and we're going to see how the light of Jesus is extended to all people. And we're going to look at some different groups, and some of those groups you might identify with, and some of those groups you might not identify with. You might identify with a group that Jesus interacts with and see how he brings light to your world. Or maybe there might be a group of people that you don't identify with, and that's going to be an opportunity for you to think about maybe how would you bring light to that group of people in your life. So tonight, the group of people that we're going to look at who Jesus brings light to is the Pharisees. That's right. Jesus and the Pharisees, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I've had 2 working titles for this talk. The first one is, what does Jesus have to say to pretentiously pious people? Or other working title is, what does Jesus have to say to me? So let's start here, Luke chapter 18. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. But he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord. So all of the gospel writers have this group of people called the Pharisees present in the text. Matthew has 12 references to the Pharisees. Mark has 7 references to the Pharisees. John has 9 references to the Pharisees, but it is Luke with 16 references to the Pharisees, who definitely paints us the most nuanced picture and the most interactions of this group of people with Jesus. They first appear in Luke chapter 5, and the last time the Pharisees are mentioned in the book of Luke is in this text in Luke chapter 18. And throughout the book of Luke, what we see is there's an escalating interaction between this group of people called the Pharisees and Jesus. And most surprising and troubling for me is something that I had never seen before, which is that in the book of Luke, Jesus shares 3 meals 3 different times with 3 different Pharisees. Why was that troubling for me? Because I like the idea of like Jesus eats with messed up people, right? Like we all kind of rally around the idea of like, hey, if you're messed up, Jesus sits down and has a meal with you. But the idea of like Jesus eats with morally self-righteous, pretentious people doesn't sound so well. It doesn't sit as well. And so I think we pause. And so the question is, well, who are the Pharisees? What is this group of people that Jesus is bringing light to? A bit of historical background on who the Pharisees are. They're one of three sects in Judaism during the time of Jesus in Israel, all leading different expressions about how they thought the Jewish people should interact with the dominant culture around them. The three groups are the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. So the Sadducees would have been like the religious elite that were interacting and basically had completely adopted Roman culture, but at some points were still holding on to their spiritual practice, and so they had completely married the two. The Pharisees were definitely the religious moralists. They were devout about being reformed and about keeping Torah or the law. And then you had the Essenes, which were really the radical separatists, and they had basically completely secluded themselves out in the desert, and they were trying to avoid as much of the dominant culture as possible. And so the group that we are interacting with tonight, that Jesus is interacting with, are the Pharisees, not to be lumped with everybody. But it does seem to be that if you've grown up around church, what you have recognized is that the Pharisees are the bad guys, right? If they're in a melodrama, every time they walk onto the scene, you would boo them, right? If you grew up in a particular strain of Christianity like me, you would sing songs about them, and you would say, I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see. My attempts tonight are just to be a bit more nuanced than that, and hopefully a little bit more helpful about what does Jesus have to say to people who have a predisposition to being pious and religious, and what might we have to say to each other if that's the camp that we find ourselves in. What was at the very core of being a Pharisee? What was their core motivating factor? And why did their motivating factor end up at odds with Jesus? Eugene Peterson writes this in his book, The Jesus Way. Imagine yourself moving into a house with a huge picture window overlooking a grand view across a wide expanse of water, enclosed by a range of snow-capped mountains. You are captivated by the view. Several times a day, you interrupt your work and stand before the window to take in the majesty and the beauty, thrilled by the botanical and meteorological fireworks. One afternoon, you notice some bird droppings on the window glass. You get a bucket of water and a towel and you clean it. A couple days later, a rainstorm leaves the window streaked and a bucket comes out again. Another day, visitors come with a tribe of small, dirty-fingered children. The moment they leave, you see all the smudge marks on the glass. They are hardly out the door before you have the bucket out. Keeping that window clean develops into an obsessive-compulsive neurosis. You accumulate ladders and buckets and squeegees. You construct scaffolding both inside and out to make it possible to get to all the difficult corners and heights. You have the cleanest window in North America. But it's now been years since you looked through it. You've become a Pharisee. See, the Pharisees start off enthralled by the grandeur and the greatness of God. And they become obsessive about window washing, missing out on the thing that they once were introduced to, maybe enthralled by, God's goodness to his people. They have now become completely obsessed about keeping the meticulous moral points of life. If there was any group that one would have guessed that Jesus would have applauded for their efforts, it would have been this group. If there was any group that you and I might think maybe Jesus could go after them and kind of leverage their loyalty to God, this would have been the group. But those morally upright people who were good students and good studiers and always trying to do the right thing actually don't get any applause from Jesus at all. Actually, they are at odds with him throughout the whole narrative. And I think there's three issues that really confront Jesus about who the Pharisees are, and that Jesus confronts the Pharisees about who they are. And the light of Jesus illuminates these three differences. The first is that they have conflicting views on God. See, the issue between Jesus and the Pharisees is that Jesus says God is merciful to all. Psalm 145, God is merciful, slow to anger, abounding in love. This is the Father that Jesus is representing. This is not the God that the Pharisees knew. See, the Pharisees held to that God gave a law, and that law needed to be kept. But the best way to keep the law is to put little laws around the big laws so that you don't break the big laws. You just make sure that you don't break the little laws. And just in case some of the little laws were problematic, you just made smaller laws. And so basically their whole construct was that there was an authoritarian God that had created a law, and if we could just obey the law, then we would gain his approval. And this was not the way that Jesus interacted with who God was. The Pharisees' view of God was primarily that he was an upset deity, and that anytime that anything went wrong with Israel, it was because that somebody had done something wrong. And so if we could just get everybody to do the right thing, then God would like us again. And that was not the God that Jesus came to expose to the world. The second is, I think that one of the things that they had a conflicting view on was a conflicting view of others. See, the issue between Jesus and the Pharisees is that they see everyone through the lens of their lack of moral perfection and their religious impurity. And they actually saw Jesus as a primary obstacle to what they believed was the kingdom or salvation. Because Jesus wasn't following the laws the way that they thought he should be following them. Primarily in Luke, they're always upset at him because he's always breaking their little laws around the Sabbath. He's always doing stuff like healing people on the Sabbath, which annoyed them because they're like, we're not sure if you can do that. And when you do that, you are breaking one of the big laws, which is, the top 10, keep the Sabbath. Jesus doesn't follow the laws their way, and he doesn't interact with people their way. The Pharisees are this incredibly inhospitable group because primarily what they're spending their time doing is making sure who's in and who's out by who's kept the rules and who hasn't kept the rules. And these 3 meals that Jesus has with the Pharisees in Luke, sometimes it seems like a setup, and sometimes it just seems to be like divine humor, that Jesus is always like healing somebody at one of the meals, or somebody from some undignified class like wanders into one of the meals and Jesus welcomes them to the table. And the Pharisees are freaking out because they're like, you can't do this. They're messy. If their mess gets close to us, then we get messy and then we're all a mess. And this is, I think, the primary difference between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees saw other people's mess as something to avoid and to stay away from and to not become impure by. And Jesus primarily saw other people's mess as something to move towards with compassion. And then the final one is, I think that they had conflicting views of themselves. The issue between Jesus and the Pharisees is that they see themselves as the ones who have it all together. Their behavior is what God's impressed with. And Jesus looks underneath their behavior and illuminates their heart. And their hearts are not humble. They are rather haughty. In Luke 11, the last of the 3 meals that Jesus shares in the home of a Pharisee, Jesus confronts the Pharisees about their hearts. And it's known as the 6 woes, which the way that Eugene Peterson called it, he's like, I've had it, which is basically if you grew up with a mother like mine, she's like, I've had it up to here, right? That's basically where Jesus was with the Pharisees at this point. He's like, I've had it up to here with you. He's like, you're pretentious in your piety, you're meticulous in your morality, but you have missed out on the mercy of God. And then we get to this text in Luke 18, the last time that Jesus talks about the Pharisees in the book of Luke. And he tells this story, this parable about these 2 who go up to the temple to pray. What's fascinating is to go up to the temple would have meant to go to Jerusalem, which is geographically the place in the text where we are, is where Jesus is now moving towards Jerusalem, moving towards the final part of his life. And he says, so these 2 people go up to the temple to pray. The first is a Pharisee. And it says in the text that he prays to himself, which could mean one of 2 things, and it might just be a play on words. One is that he prays to himself, meaning like he kind of mumbles in the corner to himself. The other is that he might actually be praying to himself. Like, hey, you're doing a great job. He's not even talking to God. He goes up to the temple not to talk to God, but to talk to himself. And what he does is he compliments his own behavior. He's like, you're doing a great job giving away what you're supposed to. And then he compares himself to the tax collector. Aren't you glad that you're not like him? That tax collector, that class of people who are not keeping the law the way that they should. But his view of God, his view of himself, and the view of others is completely in light of who he is. And he misses what God has said in the prophets that the Pharisees should have or would have studied in Isaiah 57, where it says, God is holy, but God heals those with a humble heart. And then we have this tax collector, who's a representative of this group of people who were basically the bane of the existence of the Pharisees, always messing up, never having their stuff together. And the Pharisee prays what is the most prayed prayer in the Bible. God, have mercy on me. If you want to know what the most said statement to Jesus is by people, Lord, have mercy on me. The prayer that it echoes throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, God, be merciful, have mercy. His view of God, his view of others, and his view of himself is illuminated not by who he is, but illuminated by who God is. A merciful and forgiving and loving God. And so I believe what Luke has done throughout his book is that he's shown us that the force that keeps us from the mercy of God is rarely going to be our moral failing. The force that would keep us from the mercy of God would be our self-righteousness. The way of the Pharisees is not kept to a specific sect of Judaism in 30 AD. That moralist and pretentious heart shows up early in the story of humanity, and it's threaded all the way through every culture. That group of people who think they have it all together. And Jesus illuminates them and he confronts them, I think, because of his love for them. I had a mentor about 20 years tell me this quote. His name was Jim. The only people Jesus did not have anything nice to say to were the people who thought they had it all together. It's a fascinating thing. There's only one group of people that Jesus confronts. It's actually never the people whose lives are falling apart. It's never the people who don't have their act together. The only group of people that Jesus doesn't have anything nice to say to at all is the people who think they have it all together. And that was an incredibly important thought to me, because it was about 20 years ago that I walked out of a church that I was on staff at. Got done with the service, I walked out to the parking lot, and it's one of my most clear cognitive memories that I stood by the door of my green 1981 BMW 320i, beautiful car, horrible electronic system. And as I was standing there talking to a friend of mine, I said this thought. I wonder if I will ever know what it means to need God's grace. Which is a scary thing to have come out of your mouth. But it was, as it says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. See, I had followed the rules. I had towed the line. I had been incredibly meticulous in my morality. And I was even fairly kind to the people who couldn't keep their stuff together as well as I could. And I stood there in that parking lot, and I just got done listening to a talk about these two brothers, the younger brother who goes off and squanders everything, and the older brother who stays at home, always dutifully doing what he was told to do. Happens to be in Luke 15, just a couple chapters before this story. That older brother who stays at home, always doing what's expected, but somehow had missed out on the Father's love and the Father's mercy, was actually the person that night that I most identified with in all of Scripture. Like, what do you do when you're that guy? Luke 15 shows the Father's heart, not just for the younger son who goes off and squanders everything and comes back home and he's shown forgiveness, but it also shows the Father's heart to the older son who has spent his whole life dutifully trying to keep his act together, doing everything that he thought was expected, and the Father goes out of the party and to him and he says, don't you get it? Like, I loved you. And I think Luke is careful in where he puts that story of what we consider the prodigal son, which I would call the two wayward sons. Because what he's pointing out is that Jesus' invitation to the Pharisee is the same as his invitation to anyone else. That God's mercy comes after you and that his light will illuminate your life as well. He's inviting those who think they have it all together to receive the invitation of the Father. And here is where there is good news for the Pharisees. there are those who would have participated or grew up in this religious sect who end up following the way of Jesus. A couple of them, first, a guy named Nicodemus comes to Jesus with some questions. They do a little banter at night. It's the original Nick at Night. It's a 90s joke that still plays, so I still use it. But actually, we see Nicodemus at Jesus' death, one of the very few people who publicly identifies with Jesus after the crucifixion. He shows up to embalm the body, and he's met there with another person of the Pharisees named Joseph of Arimathea. Another Pharisee, another person who would have spent his whole life trying to do the right thing, but it is at Jesus' death that he shows up and actually asks Pilate for Jesus' body to bury in his tomb. And then maybe the third and the most encouraging Pharisee is this guy named Saul. Saul shows up in the next book that Luke writes, which is Acts. Luke and Acts are like two parts of the same story. And Saul is confronted by Jesus in this miraculous light that actually blinds him for a time. And Saul is this person who would have participated in this sect of Judaism that was predisposed to miss the mercy of God and spend his whole life meticulous about his morality, but actually he becomes the primary promoter of grace and is responsible for planting most of the churches in the Roman Empire. What's fascinating is to find out that the person who traveled probably the longest with Paul was Luke. Luke, the author of all these stories about the Pharisees. Luke, the only non-Jewish writer in the whole of the New Testament. Luke, who was probably, he's considered a physician, but was probably more of like a holistic understanding or a student and teacher of mind and body. His occupation would have been seen the exact same way by the Pharisees as a tax collector. Luke, the one who would have been kept on the outside by the Pharisees, now travels with a former Pharisee to plant churches around the Roman Empire. Luke is this outsider, and he becomes a champion of the outsider. And his writing is meticulous when you start to look at his style of writing. And I kind of make up that the reason that Luke and Paul got along is that they were both meticulous, but they just figured out the things to be meticulous about weren't like the little moral mini rules, but they were going to be meticulous about how they unfolded the story of God. And I think Luke shows how the light of Jesus has come for all, including the Pharisees, people like me. Jesus extends light and peace to the religious in the room and invites us to extend light and peace to those religious people in our lives. I would like to close with just two practices and questions for you. The first is, I think, a way to avoid becoming or staying as a Pharisee is to practice humility. My friend Jim used to ask a question following up on his question or statement, I guess, about that Jesus didn't have anything nice to say to everybody who thought they had it all together. His question was, why do you need Jesus today? And I would rephrase it as this: why do I need God's mercy today? If you have a day or a run of days where you can't say why you need God's mercy, you are in danger of ending up in this camp of Pharisees. And the second is practice hospitality. I think the reason that hospitality is so important and showing God's mercies to others is so important is because when you're on your own, you think that you can have it all together, but it's actually just like when you start being around others and you start inviting them in, what you recognize is that you're as broken as they are. And there's something really beautiful about being confronted with your humanity, because all of us are great until one other human walks into the room, right? We've all got our stuff together until just that one other human walks into the room. And so we practice humility and we practice hospitality and we allow the light of Jesus to come to us to save us. Jesus brings peace to all, even pretentious people like me. Would you pray with me? Father, thanks that you come after us, regardless of our background, regardless of our story, regardless of how much time or how little time we have spent in the kind of practice. And so I ask specifically for people in the room tonight whose story kind of hovers around, always trying to keep their act together. Would they know your mercy, your love for them? I pray this in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. Amen.